In the early 1980s, a slick-talking man from Florida with aviator glasses and a killer smile walked into the Minnesota town of Princeton, population 3,000. His name was Casey Ramirez. Casey touted himself as a wealthy businessman and an aviation enthusiast. Princeton happened to have a small airport just to his liking, so he purchased it. It was somewhat of a relief for the community. The municipal airport had become a growing problem, one that cost the city of Princeton more than it had bargained for. Before Casey Ramirez came on the scene, they were struggling, and the fate of the airport was up in the air. His dealings in Princeton didn't end there, though. He told the community he wanted to give back, share the wealth. Casey financed a new youth hockey rink. He purchased vehicles for the local police department. He funded new computers for City Hall. And he gifted the town with palm trees, a lot of them. As for the airport, he improved it. He turned it from a dying runway into an impressive and functional spectacle. He was the driving force behind a yearly town event, too, which brought residents together at the airport. Children were offered helicopter rides, airplane rides, and there was plenty of food. He was the answer to so many of Princeton's problems. And he was likable. A friendly, wealthy guy with international business connections and deep pockets. Plus, when he went out on the town, he bought the locals plenty of drinks. He was larger than life, it seemed, until he wasn't. By the mid-1980s, the town of Princeton learned the real reason Casey Ramirez settled among them, and they learned where his money came from. He was an international drug smuggler, and he used the Princeton airport as a means to smuggle drugs and money from the Bahamas to Florida to Minnesota. By 1984, he was convicted for smuggling cocaine and money laundering. How do I know all of this information? From Minnesota Vice, a recent web series published on the Vault site. The author is Jeremy Fugleberg, and on this episode, we're going to take a look behind the curtain of his years-long investigation into Casey Ramirez. This is the story behind the story. I think that, readers and listeners, they absorb the information, the story that we put out there, but what happens behind the scenes, just that process of investigating, reporting, I think is a story in and of itself. So that's what I really want to cover with you today. So we're focusing on Minnesota Vice, your most recent series. And as I was reading your series, and even when I learned that it was coming out, I recall, and correct me on the timeline here, but a couple of years ago, you began looking into the story. I remember hearing you talk about it in one of our weekly Vault meetings. And so obviously this is something you've been working on for a really long time. So let's start from the beginning. When did you first hear about Casey Ramirez?
Oh yeah, I'd never heard of this guy before. But our colleague Rob Beer, who's now the sports editor at the Forum in Fargo, he grew up in Princeton, and knew about this story. And so one day out of the blue, Rob messages me and says, "Hey, have you ever heard of a guy named Casey Ramirez?" And I said, "No. What's the story?" And he's like, "Yeah, I think it could be a really interesting story. I've thought about writing something, but something maybe you should look into." So he sent me a few links, and then that started me down the rabbit hole. And it grabbed me right away just because I don't know. You know how it is probably. Like you look at something and you're like, yeah, that's pretty interesting. And then there's sometimes when it just keeps, things keep popping up
Mm-hmm.
and they add up to, it's like, oh, that's going to be a good story. Like it has to be a good story. It has all these different elements.
Mm-hmm.
And so for this one, it was small town, cocaine smuggling, airplanes, palm trees, and it kind of made me think like Miami Vice in the 80s, and it had all these different things. And it all centered on this tiny little Minnesota town. So it's kind of crazy that all these elements could happen there. And that was just in the first few minutes of looking the story up.
Right. So you mentioned the small town of Princeton. And so for those of us who are listening, I've never been there. And, I know small town Minnesota, but I'm assuming you were there multiple times. Can you tell us a little bit about Princeton?
Yeah, it's a cute little town. It was about 3,000 people back in the 80s. It's about 5,000 now. It's maybe, I don't know, maybe an hour's drive north of the Twin Cities. It's on sort of a main north-south highway. So a lot of people that would go drive through Princeton are heading to lake cabins in the north, or they're going fishing and or coming back from there. And so it has a long tradition of sort of being a stop on the highway.
Hmm.
And it's farm country, it's dairy country. It used to be back in the day, it was had all sorts of crops. It was really famous. Just north of there was like a big brick factory for the longest time. It was big into potatoes. So it's had various eras where it's done well with one thing or the other. Um, and then right now it's actually it's a thriving town. Like I said, it grew. It's 5,000 person town. It's got a main street with businesses on it.
Hmm.
Of course, there's the Walmart on the outside of town. But it seems to be doing really well.
I would imagine it was kind of your home away from home for a little bit, and it will always hold a special spot in your heart. Where did you begin when like you said, you realized this was going to be a good story? Where was your starting point? Was it going to
Yeah,
Princeton?
yeah, so I started doing a lot of research. I'm a big, research nerd anyway. So I'm just pulling up every single available like news clip I can find and stuff like that. So before I'd even driven to Princeton, I read up a lot of the old news coverage. But it was still, so I'd never been to Princeton either before that. I think I'd probably been by it a few times, but I don't think I'd ever really stopped there.
Hmm.
And you're right, it does actually mean something to me now. I have a Princeton high school t-shirt I wear around all the
Yeah,
time.
for sure.
Um, and I don't know, I don't think they feel the same way about me. But
We'll get to
I
that.
met some great people there and people I still talk to, and so a lot of really good people there. But yeah, so I did a lot of research first, and then of course thought I've got to go up there and see what's going on. So Rob had told me there was files on Casey Ramirez in the local history museum, kind of the historical society, the county historical society. So that was my first stop when I drove up there, and I was like, I'm going to spend a couple days here. I'm going to stop at all the locations that I've kind of mapped out from the research, and then talk to the historical society people. And I walked in the door and said, "Oh, I'm here. I'm a journalist. I'm interested in the Casey Ramirez file." And the first thing they said was, "Well, he's still around, right?"
Dang.
No, I didn't know that. So then they trotted out that whole box, and they had all these clippings and things that I hadn't seen before, and they talked about it, and they were holding newsprint down for me so I could get pictures of it. And people kept coming in. It's only open a few days a week, so people would come in, bring things in, and they'd say like, "Oh, he's here about Casey Ramirez," and people would be like, "Oh yeah, that guy." And, it was really great, little small
Were
town
you
experience.
somewhat surprised by that because you didn't know what to expect going in there because some of past coverage wasn't necessarily appreciated and they didn't maybe want to be known as the cocaine town?
Yeah. No, I wondered about that. I mean, some of the research I had done, it seemed like people would always say, yes, Princeton, the only thing it's known for at this point is still Casey Ramirez. So I wasn't sure how that would go. And it's also kind of a weird thing because it's 40 years old now, this story,
Hmm.
which is still within a lot of people's lifetimes, right?
Hmm.
So, I wasn't sure who I was going to run into or if some people would be upset or not. And the historical society people were they see it as both sort of this historical thing in Princeton's history, but also still something that's really interesting to a lot of people who are alive. And Casey's still around, apparently. So it's this weird sort of mix of history and present day.
Yeah, and I think it's important for people to understand too that when you're walking into a situation like that, the people at, in this case, the Historical Society Museum, the way that they react to you or the way that they choose to participate or not participate can play such a critical role in everything when it comes to putting a story like this together.
Yeah, they were central to, I mean, they're kind of this invisible invisible friends in the background for
Yeah.
research, and they had some ideas of some other people I could talk to in town. And then months, almost 2 years down the line, they became the repository for all the local newspapers' archives, and all their photos got put in this historical society, which was a gold mine.
Wow.
And so without them, I wouldn't have had any of that. So yeah, crucial.
Yeah, and so that information, when you gathered that information, I would imagine this is, new information for you as you learn, the story starts to take shape in your brain. And so where did that lead you?
Uh, at first I wasn't sure kind of how I was going to tell the story. And it really kind of depended on who was going to talk to me, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I thought maybe Casey Ramirez is sort of the main character I thought in my head at the time would maybe he'd talk to me. Maybe I could track him down and he would say, "Oh yeah, I'm happy to talk about this thing that happened in the past," and it'd be no big deal. Or, maybe a lot of people in the town would talk to me about what they thought, and that would be sort of maybe the focus. Or
Hmm.
so I had all sorts of possible angles that I thought it could kind of go, just depending on who was willing to talk to me and what was willing to come out of it. And I really struggled early because no one would talk to me.
Yeah.
I Casey never got back to me. I tried multiple ways of getting in touch with him. He wasn't easy to find. Um, People that he knew, I tried to talk to, and then even just people in the town. There was people I would talk to in the town, and they'd say, "Oh, that's ancient history. Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it." Blah blah blah. And then they say, "Well, I don't want to be on the record though." And I'm like,
Hmm.
"Well, it's ancient history. What's the concern?" And they're like, "Yeah, I don't. I just don't want. I don't want to have any." So I started stacking up people that I'd interviewed that were just off the record, and I was starting to get a little frantic early on because I was like, nobody's going to talk to me. What do I
Yeah.
do with a story where nobody talks to you
Yeah.
on the record?
Yeah, absolutely. And that is that is such I don't want to say obstacle, but that is such an aspect maybe of our jobs that people don't understand that we really do respect when someone says, "Don't use my name." I mean, it's a real thing off the record, on the record, and we take it seriously. And so, like you said, you're sitting there, all this information, you know what they have to say is valuable. Sometimes people don't realize what they have to say is valuable, or like you said, maybe they don't want to be attached to something that other people aren't going to like. They don't want to bring themselves into that drama. But even that whole process of, I don't want to say convincing, but, showing people why this might be beneficial to society or whatever other aspect makes it beneficial to tell their story. But Casey Ramirez, I want to stop there because I'm sure everybody listening is like, tell us how you tried to track him down. So let's start there, just from the beginning when you learned that he was still around.
So the first thing I did, well, I'd already done some research. I'd Googled him, just some really basic stuff like that, and hadn't really found anything helpful. I wasn't even sure if he was still around. So when they said, "Oh, he's still around," and one thing that cracked it right away for me is one of the people that was coming and going in the historical society. This guy comes in. I think he was the Zamboni driver at the local ice rink,
Fantastic.
and he's just kind of shooting the bull and catching up with people. And they said, "Oh, he's here to talk about or do something on Casey Ramirez." And he's like, "Oh yeah, yeah, that guy." And then he looks at me and he kind of cocks his head and goes, "I think he sells cell phones."
What?
And I was like, "What? What?" And he's like, "Yeah, yeah, I think he sells cell phones. I can't remember much more about it." So, and that was it. So then I thought, well, that's got to be something. I haven't heard that before. And so after I finished at the museum, I went straight to the McDonald's, which is always a source of good internet in small
Hmm.
towns, and sat down and just started again Googling Casey Ramirez and all sorts of different combinations of cell phone providers, and popped up a video of a video interview of him from relatively recent, from 2012, where he was a Verizon salesman. And it was this feel-good story out of the Twin Cities about a woman trying to get logged onto Facebook, and he had been helping her. Um, and I looked at it, and I'm watching, and I was like, "This is my guy." Like I've only seen old photos of him at this point, but I was like, "This is my guy. I swear this is my guy." And so at that point,
Hmm.
I'm like, I, he felt right there, and I was like, "I gotta do this story. Like I gotta dig more into this." So that was the start of trying to figure out who Casey Ramirez was.
And I bet you wouldn't have imagined in 1,000 years that he was going to be found as a Verizon salesman helping a woman
No,
in a news story. That is
no.
wild.
But the one thing that jumped out at me that made me want to dig into it more was not just him, it was how they had him labeled.
Oh.
Because his name wasn't Casey Ramirez, his name was Joseph, and that's my understanding was that was his legal first name, so that made sense. But they said his last name was Ramireza, like Ramirez with an A added to it, and I was like, that's not true.
Yeah,
And so I started digging around, being like, is there anybody else with that name in Minnesota? And
yeah.
I'm maybe confusing it. No, that name is not a real person's name. So I was like, he lied. He lied to them. He made up a name
Mm-hmm.
on for when he was going to go on television in 2012, like decades after he was in prison for something, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he's still trying to hide, and I was like, I gotta dig into this guy.
And also not exactly a very original um way to try to hide yourself. But all right, so from there, where'd you go?
So we have some access to some sort of like background check kind of service, right? Where you can
Hmm.
dig up somebody's records of addresses and where they were. And so we pulled that up originally, and it was not helpful. It actually pointed to two different people, including somebody with a very different name in, I believe, North Carolina. And it was very confusing. It crossed different. So background checks, a lot of people don't know this. They think background checks, if you can get something like that, it's this hard and fast, tells you everything you need to know about somebody. There's no confusion, and it couldn't be further from the truth.
Hmm.
Background checks are like giant vacuums of information that that the people that collect that think relates to the person you're looking for, and that's not always right.
Yeah.
It's not always timely. It's not always, so they'll say, oh, this is a current address. It's not even that person's address. They'll say this is a current number. It's not, it's a number they had as a cell phone in like 1999.
Hmm.
It's just wild. And or it'll even show like, oh, here's some people who they're associated to. And that's just can be terribly unreliable. But there are little details
Yeah.
that if you dig enough, might pop up and maybe tie a few things together. So that background check was one place to start, but it immediately told me there wasn't a lot of information, clear-cut information about this guy out there. And a lot of people, most people, there is information out there. It's maybe confusing and it's not perfect when you look it up, but there's a lot. And for
Hmm.
him, there was almost nothing. It was almost like he hadn't existed for decades.
Did it even have his federal charges and conviction on there?
No, no, no,
Which
it had
I'm
none of that.
interesting.
It also showed he was tied to two different social security numbers,
Oh,
which it didn't give me the full social security number because it never gives you that, but
right.
it did show that he was tied to two separate numbers, which also was very weird, right?
Hmm.
Because that's not a very common thing for people to be tied to two social security numbers. So that made me also wonder too, like, okay, if he's for you to not have that much information in this report, it means you've also been intentionally kind of living off the radar a little bit,
For
right?
sure.
Or
Yeah.
purposely throwing up smoke screens.
So you must have felt at that point, I mean, it's almost like he's within reach. He's so close, but so far away.
Yeah, yeah. Because I figured he lived, people seem to agree that he lived in the area or they'd seen him around recently and it was all kind of vague. But then I could find nothing definite for him. I found some phone numbers that seemed maybe linked to him, but then they weren't. And I found some addresses, but then they didn't seem current or really linked to him. And so I was kind of coming up empty on this guy, right? And I really was thinking with the story is like I gotta stay on him, right? Because
Hmm.
I can do a story about this guy, but you gotta talk to the guy, right? Like if it's at all possible, you gotta talk to the guy.
Yeah, you got to
And
try.
so,
Yeah.
yeah, and so I was really starting to hit some dead ends with this until I got National Archive records.
I was just gonna say, I also remember when you got into the archives. What was it in Chicago?
It was in Chicago. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
And that is where you discovered, and correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of the information that in your reporting had never been reported before, documents that had never been seen or reported on. So
yeah.
what did
Stacks and
you,
stacks.
stacks and stacks. All right. So you go in there and you must have felt like a kid at a candy shop. What was, what was like or did you discover one one piece of information first, or was it just the sheer amount of documentation that you knew you had to work with that really made you think, okay, this is going somewhere?
My initial problem was getting there because it's in Chicago. And I was like, there's no way Forum's going to pay for me to fly to Chicago and go through the archives. Like, we don't have that kind of budget.
Hmm.
So but I was like, I feel like that I'm really going to need this, and especially because nobody was talking to me, I was like, I really need these court records. And so I emailed the National Archives people in Chicago, and they said, yeah, we have them here, but you got to come here to view them.
Wow.
And I said, well, okay, I'll see what I can do. And then, as luck would have it, I had a trip that actually flew through Chicago. And so I was able to arrange it so I could fly in and then fly out later. So I went there. I had this basically like one day in
Yeah.
the Chicago archives to get everything that was in there, just vacuum it dry. So I showed up, I had a camera, I got my little external batteries, I've got all my stuff. And it's a little office. It's just a few people. I don't think they get like tons of researchers.
Sure.
It's a huge warehouse, but the front, like the research area is very small.
Yeah.
And so they were right there waiting for me. Oh, come on in. They opened the door and I sat down, and they got to keep a close eye on you because these are the only official records, right? There's
Oh,
no
yeah.
copies of these. These are the real things. So you can't bring anything into the room, and there's signs all over that say you can't take anything with you and don't mark anything with a pen,
Yeah.
and you can't even bring pens in. But then they sit somebody right there, and they can do work, but they're basically watching you
Yeah.
while you do all this.
Yeah. A guard.
But then yeah, then they rolled it out, and it's boxes and boxes, cardboard archive boxes on a wooden cart, and they just said, "Here you go." Um,
So
and
how
there it was.
how much, first of all, I do want to say that you might be the only person who had a layover in Chicago and went to the National Archives. And I'm
That's
pretty
probably
confident.
true.
Yeah.
I also showed up with luggage, like, because I got like a
Yeah.
Uber there, right? And I looked the Midway Airport, it's like really close to the archives. So I was like, this is gonna work out great. So I showed up with my rolling luggage, and the archives guys were like, What's the deal with the bags?" And I was like, I'm actually on a layover. This is my luggage. I don't need to bring this in. And they're like, okay, just put it over
Yeah.
here. So yeah.
Showing up with a suitcase. So how long did you have then to go through all of that information and, take photos of what you needed to?
I got there very soon after they opened. So I 8 hours maybe, front to
Okay.
back.
Were you there the
Yeah,
whole
so like a whole
time?
day. Yeah. I think I did one bathroom break that day. I didn't eat anything the entire day. I just sat there and just got documents.
Did you did you make it through all of them?
Yes. Yeah. There were a couple things that were about other cases that somehow made it into the folders,
Hmm.
that I don't think were actually supposed to be there. So there's some stuff that I didn't document. But my goal was to not read everything.
Yeah.
My goal was to capture everything. So I set up, I had a little camera on a stand, and then I had a little remote, like little Bluetooth clicker to get photos of each document, and then just like click, 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 flip, 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 flip. And just trying to just capture everything that was in all these boxes, page after page after page after file after file after file. And so it was, I can't remember how many, 6,000 images or something.
I was gonna say that must
Um,
a lot.
Yeah, yeah, it was a lot. And so I got to the end of the day and was just exhausted, but also really elated because even not carefully reading what was in there, it was immediately obvious that this was a gold mine. It was transcripts from the entire trial.
Hmm.
It had pieces of the grand jury testimony from before. There was some stuff that was still sealed that I couldn't even open. There was investigative reports from the DEA that had been included in various folders. There were evidence lists. There were addresses for everybody involved. There was, oh man, there was testimony in a trial from years prior that was related. There was letters that family members had written to try to get one of the people involved paroled. There was a whole hearing that Casey Ramirez did after he'd been imprisoned, where he said a bunch of stuff, and it actually the the argument from the defense involved the fact that he had two social security numbers,
Oh.
um, which I was like, well, that sounds familiar. So
Hmm.
it was so much there, and it was like I need to make sure this is okay. and safe. So I like backed everything up right away and like got everything
Mm-hmm.
up to the cloud. I was like, I'll be able to look at all this later. So yeah, gold mine, just a gold mine.
Was there a big smoking gun or something in all of that that made you that you didn't know that made your jaw drop?
Ooh, smoking gun. So I knew the basic outline of what had happened in the trial and some things
Mm-hmm.
about the case just from the newspaper coverage. But newspaper reporters, like we know, can't write everything that happens. And so I
Mm-hmm.
was like, there's probably a lot of information there kind of in the cracks. And there was. There's just a tremendous amount. There was a lot of witnesses that testified that didn't make it into the articles,
Mm-hmm.
the reporting at the time. And so all these, I started looking at, I was like, okay, now I've got all the elements to tell a story effectively, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
to have all the facts. These are people sworn testimony, on the record with their names about what they saw and experienced. And so now this is something I can actually, this is the framework I could build a story on.
Yeah.
Um, the thing that jumped out at me was the, uh, when Casey had been in prison and was trying to essentially talk a judge into letting him out. Um, he had it was a long hearing, and the state was basically arguing that he shouldn't be let out because he probably was hiding a lot of assets. And he was insisting that, in fact, he wasn't. He represented himself. He did a great job. He cross-examined witnesses by himself. And then he kept what I kept seeing with Casey is I read about him in the trial, and they're like, oh, he was kind of sarcastic and seemed like he didn't care and was making jokes all the time. And you just sort of assume that, I don't know, that maybe people change. But in this hearing, this is now 13 years later after he got found guilty. He's still making arguments and kind of cracking jokes, and at one point said, um, to the prosecution, there's like he's got two social security numbers. He's probably hiding something, and he said, "Well, they don't even have my birth date right. And in fact, my they have Diego as my middle name. That's not even my middle name." Um, and he was right. He actually, the Bureau of Prisons had incorrect birth date for him, and in fact, I tracked down birth records for him, like archives, so like birth records, and then a census bureau census taker had marked him down in the apartment where he was living with his family when he was very small, and
Mm-hmm.
they had his first name was Diego.
Oh,
So it wasn't his middle name. So it was funny because he was saying these things, and I was like, he's given pieces of himself away
yeah.
while he's trying to make fun of people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so again, just with like, I was like, this guy, he's so elusive, and he's constantly kind of mocking the system. Um, and so yeah, that grabbed me, and that I was like, that just made me want to keep working on it.
Yeah, you start to understand him a little bit more, and he
Yeah,
evolves as a human being. And yeah, that is really interesting. And it does say a lot, like you said, this was 13 years after.
yeah.
Who who were some of the key people that you were able to track down from that information?
So I made a giant list of everybody that was named in this, and I was surprised how many people had died. But then it makes sense. This is 40 years ago. A lot
Mm-hmm.
of people that were interviewed were already getting up in age, and 40 years time comes for us all. So there's just a lot of people that had passed. There was a fair number of people that I couldn't ever find. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and but there were members of the investigative team, and I'd heard about some of them. I had a few names. And then from the trial testimony, they'd actually testified
Mm-hmm.
in the trial. And so I thought the investigative team, right? That's the next place for me to go here. They're probably going to know this better than anybody. The prosecutor was dead. The
Mm-hmm.
attorney for Casey was dead. The judge was dead. Members of the jury were dead. Some of the key witnesses were dead. But I was like, I hope some of the investigative team is still alive. And what it seemed to be is there was a core set of team. There's three people. One was a DEA agent. One was a Minneapolis police sergeant who was on a DEA task force, and another one was an IRS agent. And so that became my next mission then was to track these people down and see if they'd be willing to talk to me.
Mm-hmm. And
Uh, so the DEA agent, I started looking into her, and I realized that she actually had gone from that job to actually running the DEA under Bush and Obama. So that was like, oh, that's incredible. Like, but that might make her hard to track down. I'm going to see what I can
Right.
find there.
Yeah.
The police sergeant, he's from what I could tell, he still lived in the Twin Cities area and he was still alive. So I called and left. I found a number and left a message for him.
Hmm.
Did the same with the IRS agent, um, and and then never heard back from any of them. And I wanted to give them a little bit of time, but after a while, I was like, okay, I gotta figure out another way to get to these. So I started doing more research and figured out that the DA agent's husband was actually a city council member, or had been a city council member in the town that they lived, which meant he had more public visibility, which meant I could track down some contact information for him, which meant that I contacted him and was like, "Hey, I really want to talk to your wife.
Yeah.
Please let me talk to your wife."
Hmm.
And he's like, "Oh yeah, I'll." And he got right back to me. He's like, "Yeah, I'll have her get back to you." And then I never heard back from her. So I never heard back from the other two, and I sat there and corresponded, and then she eventually got back to me. She's like, "Yeah, I'd be willing to talk." This had been months now. I've been working on other stuff, and I was like, I'm never going to be able to hear from the investigative team, which really sucks. They're a really
Hmm.
key component here, but I'm going to keep working on it. She got back to me and she said, yeah, we'd be willing to talk. And I said, great, let's set up a time. And then so this happened a lot where I'd hear from her and then she'd kind of just go dark for a while. And then I'd say like, hey, really interested in that interview. And she'd be like, oh yeah, definitely open to it. I'll check and see if there's some good times. And then I wouldn't hear for another 2 months or
Hmm.
something. Um, so I was like, when do you decide when to stop bothering somebody? And
Hmm.
so I was like, I'm just going to be honest. So I sent her a message and was like, look, I really want to interview you and the other people of the team, and it seems like you're willing to, but also this isn't like. Let me know if I'll stop bothering you if you want me to. Like, I'm happy to
Right.
leave you
Yep.
alone. Um, I just want to know,
Yep.
basically.
Yeah.
Um, and she's like, yeah, let me talk to the guys. We'll set up a time. And I was like, I don't know.
Yep.
And then sure enough, she did. She reached out and was like, "Yeah, talk to the other two guys. Let's set up a time. We would like to do kind of preliminary phone call to just make sure that we're comfortable with you." And as I found out later, they'd actually been checking up on me.
Mm.
Like these are three investigators. Like that's
That's
so which I
comforting.
don't know why that hadn't
Yeah.
crossed my mind, but they'd been like
Yeah.
doing some work to figure out if I was legit or if I was. So apparently they'd gotten burned really early after this case. They'd gotten burned by this really crappy like tabloid true crime TV show
Hmm.
that did sort of a scripted reenactment of what they told them.
Oh.
Um,
Hmm.
I desperately looked for copies of this. I can't find it.
I was just gonna say.
I'd love it.
Yeah.
Apparently, they shot places that were supposed to be Princeton. There was like mountains in the background, which like if you know anything about like central Minnesota, there's no mountains.
Yeah. No.
Um, there's just nothing. So that
Yeah.
was, and then they came off looking just really dumb. And so apparently they
Mm.
swore after that they're like, we're never going to talk to media again about this,
Hmm.
and they didn't for 40 years, right? So apparently, so they were checking me out, which I didn't mind and appreciated because they were like, okay, he seems like a legit reporter and he's not
Hmm.
going to make us tabloid cartoons. So then we did kind of a pre-screening conversation. Off the record, I wasn't recording anything, which I made very clear to them. We just talked. So they asked me about who I was and my background and why I wanted to do this and what made me interested in it. And it felt very much like a first date, kind of. Um,
Yeah.
where it's like they definitely Googled me. It's sort of like you've
Hmm.
Googled the person, but like you want to like tell me about yourself.
Yeah.
Um, and and that's what it felt like. So, and I wasn't really. They were definitely. It was more of an interview, I guess. They were interviewing me for a job of interviewing them than
I
it
was just
was
gonna
a
say
first
you
date.
have like
Because
investigators with investigators and
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. There was also what I quickly realized too is that um, it wasn't always like the answers to the questions that I had that mattered to them. It was me being able to demonstrate how much about the case I actually knew, right?
Mm. Hmm.
And then at this point, by the time I had this conversation now, I had done the vast amount of the research into the story, had timelines built out, had full indexes of everybody involved and where they had were and how they connected. So like it was all right up in my head.
You were
And
living in it.
yeah, I
Yeah.
was living in it. Like I was deeper into 1983 than they were, you know.
Yeah.
For them, it was a year, 40 years ago. For me, I was like living and breathing this and what had
Yeah.
happened this month. And so there were even times and they'd be like, oh yeah, and then that's the month we flew to the Bahamas. And I was like, yeah, actually it was April. Um,
Yeah.
and I was not in like
No,
a
I know. Yeah.
mean way, but they're like, oh yeah, April, right? So it's like
Yeah.
because I've read all their inter testimony and all the
Yeah.
interviews and so anyway, by the end of that, they said, okay, I think we're comfortable with this. We're ready to move forward. Let's set up a time. And so we sat down for, I'm trying to remember how long that lasted. 4 hour interview. It was all three of them.
Hmm.
And I'd done a bunch of research and I'd kind of given some ideas of what I was going to be asking them because they kind of want to be prepared. I had a bunch of documents. So this is something that a lot of people might not know about investigators, like for law enforcement. They don't keep files. Like when they finish with an investigation, it belongs to the governmental agency. I mean, when they
Hmm.
finished with this case, all the documents, all the reports stayed with the DEA and the IRS and all the other agencies. They didn't keep them personally. So I had copies of things that they hadn't seen in 40 years, right? So they were asking me, they're just like, oh, hey, when was this? And I'd go like look it up and I'd be like, okay. And
Hmm.
I found that one file from the archives in Chicago and be like, okay, it was this date. And they're like, oh, yeah, okay. Because they hadn't seen these files for 40 years. So there
Sure.
was a lot of
Yeah.
that too, of just kind of like, when was that again? But they also kept surprising me. I don't, we all forget things over
Hmm.
time. And these guys were like, just just razor sharp on so many memories from that time. And what I found out later is this was to this day like their favorite case.
I was going
Um,
to, I was
yeah,
just going to ask you, was this like one of the career highlights? Because it's such a chaotic and bizarre story that I would
yeah,
imagine that they must have been, I don't know if excited is the right word, but well, excited, yeah, to sit down with you. Like you said, you have all the documents here. You're living it. You know it's also stored in
yeah,
your head. And so they get to go back and relive this pivotal point in their careers.
yeah, yeah. And it was a pivotal point, and they all cared about it for that. But I think what we kind of all realized at some point independently was like we all just thought it was a really interesting story. Like it's just
Hmm.
one of these ripping yarn kind of things, right? And so they felt about it the same. And so for them to find somebody like me, who I was 3 years old when this was happening, right?
Hmm.
To find someone like me 40 years later who's just as excited about the story as they were was sort of
Yeah.
like being in the same fan club, kind of.
Yeah.
Or it's like, oh yeah, tell what happened then, right?
Hmm.
So it was kind of fun to do that. But then there also comes a lot of responsibility with that too, because it mattered a lot to me and certainly mattered to them that I treat their story with respect, right?
Yeah.
That I stay just really truthful to the facts, that I'm not embellishing it, that I'm quoting them accurately. And this is all, I mean, this always matters to me,
Hmm.
but it certainly mattered to them. And so that was something I think that was kind of a trust building process
Hmm.
for them to say, here's my information, and me to say, I'm going to be respectful with it. And so, later when I was writing the story and using their information, there was one point there where I called up the DA agent, Michelle, and I think we talked for 2 hours, and I was going through just each fact
Hmm.
and each quote and being like, here's what I have. Here's this fact. Does that accurate? Does that match with your
Hmm.
recollection of it? Does this fit with your recall of that? And not to change it to make them happy or something, but just to make sure that it comported with what there was in their memory.
Hmm.
Um, and that's the kind of work you have to do when you're trying to be really, really accurate and then also really respect people's trust in you with their own story and their own facts, their own life.
Yeah, exactly. Did you hear back from them? I'm assuming you did after the series.
Yeah, they were. I mean, they weren't. There wasn't tons of surprises because we had talked about it as much as we
Sure.
had. They obviously hadn't read it in advance, so the way the story unfolded was new to them. Although they knew the story better than anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, heard back they were happy with it. One of them was like, when are you gonna make this a book?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I was like, yeah, I would love that. So yeah, they were really pleased with it, and it felt really good to come to the end of this process and feel like I had treated them with respect and their story with respect, and then they were also happy with kind of the work that I had done. That felt really good.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, obviously when we're working on stuff, like we as journalists, we put it out there for the world, but it's those key people that you really want to make sure, like you said, that they trusted you and they were so critical to the storytelling aspect of everything. And it does really matter that they are the ones who say, I feel like this was fair and, thank you for treating me with respect and fairness. So
Yeah,
that's yeah, that's really cool. And I imagine that would have felt really good.
yeah.
I want to go to, can you tell me why Steve Wagner was driving around Arizona? And Steve Wagner is content director.
Yeah,
Is that his
I'm not sure what
title?
his official name is.
Okay, well
Yeah,
he works
Grand
here.
Grand Muckety Muck.
Yeah, he
Yeah,
does a lot of stuff.
yeah.
Director of
Um,
something.
yeah. So he lives in the Phoenix area. There is one of the main. Let me put it this way: the chief witness for the prosecution, like somebody who was involved in the cocaine smuggling and who flipped on the entire operation, was sort of this main witness against Ramirez and the crew. Was a guy named Greg Schmidt. And I had tried everything to talk to Greg Schmidt. I had tracked him down on Facebook. I had called him. I had emailed him. I had written him letters. I found his wife, and Facebook did the same thing. And again, the same thing is like, I'm not trying to be a stalker. I'm just trying to get in
Hmm.
touch and always making that clear. Like, I'm just trying to get in touch. And if you don't want to talk to me, just let me know.
Yeah, I'll go away.
Because
Yep.
like, no one's under any compulsion to talk to me, right? It's always going
Yeah.
to be voluntary. So for me, I'm just coming in there being like, here's what I'm working on. I would love for you to talk with me. If you don't, let me know. If you don't want to, let me know. And so that's what I kept sending, and never heard anything back from Greg. And it was driving me nuts. Like I've got his testimony, but
Hmm.
this is somebody I really want to talk to now if I can. So I figured out his address is in the Phoenix area, and Steve, who lives in the Phoenix area, at one point was like, I could just go over to his house.
Hmm.
And I was like, yes, you could. So I actually wrote another letter to Greg and got it to Steve. So Steve heads off into the burbs or whatever. I don't know. It's Phoenix. This is a giant
Yeah.
metroplex, so it's not even the suburbs. It's just another giant city. And carrying my letter, and goes to the house and knocks on his door, and doesn't seem like anybody's there. So he's like, "Well, I want to leave this letter somehow." And so he took a rock from right in front of the walkway and like put the letter on the front porch, like on his front, like his welcome mat. Basically, it was like letter rock, and left. And the next day, I think it was the next day, Greg Schmidt emails me, and says, "I've got some health concerns. I'm not interested in being part of your project." And I said, "Totally understand. Best of luck. You won't hear from
Hmm.
me again." Um, so yeah, Steve closed the loop on Greg Schmidt, which I really, really appreciated.
I had a meeting with him. I don't know if it was like that day or the day after, but he was like, yeah, I was just driving to deliver a letter to this witness who flipped on Casey Ramirez and, this federal drug smuggling operation. And I was like, yeah, of course. I mean,
Steve's an old news guy, and
mhm,
with the kind of job he has now, he doesn't get to do a lot of
yeah.
reporting and knocking on doors and interviewing people, and much less something where it's kind of in a story like this. And so
Hmm.
I think he was fairly eager to do something like this. I totally get it. And I really appreciated it. That's really meaningful. So yeah.
Yeah, and like you said, you were able to learn then, okay, I can cross that off my list, and I don't
Yep.
have to sit there wondering if that's going to be a piece of the puzzle that I need to put all of this together. We glossed over Casey's time in Princeton. So if we could go back to that,
Mhm.
yeah, and obviously those. people who have read the story are going to understand this, but I'm just so curious because palm trees in Minnesota,
Yes, at least one. At least one.
yeah, such a reminder, I would assume.
I was going to say, this is one other thing that happened on this first trip. Is they told me, they said, oh, that there's still a palm tree around. And I said, where is this palm tree? And they said, oh, it gets put out in front of this one warehouse on the north end of town every summer. And they showed me a picture. They're like, look, we put it on Facebook or something. I was like, oh, okay.
Hmm.
So I drove out to this warehouse. There was nobody around. And it said, go to the parts receiving door. And so I was like, well, I guess it's a public door. So I opened the door, and like, hello, and didn't hear anybody. And so I'm just standing there trying to figure out what to do. And then I look over to the left, and there's the palm tree, like right next to the door. I'm like, ah, palm tree. Um, and and there's the palm tree. Like there's this palm tree that somehow existed in Minnesota for 40 years. Um, yeah, so this palm tree exists. Apparently they it's not very big, but it's probably because it doesn't get any sun for more than half the year. It just sits in
Hmm.
the warehouse. And
Hmm.
then they bring it outside and it gets some sun and some rain, which is apparently just enough to keep it alive. So it's a very hardy palm tree.
Yeah.
But yeah, that palm tree still exists. And actually, my colleague Rob Beer got some messages about that it had gotten moved.
Oh.
And as it turns out, the former mayor of the town, who was a good friend of Casey's, uh, the palm tree is, or at least last time I saw it, was right out in front of his business in Princeton, like right out in
Oh,
front. Um,
wow.
yeah, so it felt like it was a real statement palm tree.
Yeah.
I think it
Yeah.
was before, but it definitely is now.
Absolutely. Um, Correct me if I'm wrong, but did you recently attend some sort of town festival in Princeton on the lookout for Casey? Maybe one last chance to talk to him face to face.
Yeah, so they have an annual festival called the Rum River Festival, and they it's a multi-day thing. And they have so this is something that Casey actually started when he was there, was this fly-in slash Lions pancake breakfast pancake feed at the airport. And it's something that still happens. So back in Casey's day when he was giving away uh crazy door prizes that were funded by drug money,
Yeah.
it had a huge attendance. People would fly in from all over for this because they could win cruises and stuff. Um,
Jeez.
Now there are no cruises,
Yeah.
but there is a giant. They lift the door on a big airplane hangar, and yeah, you just come in, you pay a few bucks for some pancakes and some sausages.
Hmm.
They've got some planes set out so you can go look at people's planes, and yeah, I'd heard that Casey likes to go back and visit there.
Hmm.
That's kind of his thing, and people had said, oh, he'd show up, and sometimes he'd be flashing around a bunch of money just to show he's got a bunch of money.
Hmm.
And so yeah, so I went there with my fiance,
Hmm.
who's obviously heard all of this the whole time as I've been reporting on it. Um,
Yeah.
so there we were together at the pancake breakfast in Princeton, Minnesota, at the airport, looking for Casey Ramirez, and didn't find him,
Yeah.
didn't see him, but good pancakes.
Yeah. Yeah. So he's out there somewhere, as we know. Have you heard anything about whether or not he's read your story, or I guess anything that would make you think one way or another, whether he has or he hasn't?
So I haven't heard from him. Tracking him down, I eventually did find what I'm pretty sure is his home address. I went there, I knocked on the door, talked to who I'm pretty sure is his girlfriend, handed her a letter for him. I was wearing a blue shirt. She thought I was the Schwann's guy, so that got me through the door, which was good.
That's a good tip for the future. I'm gonna
Yeah,
try
where
that.
carry yeah, I was carrying a stack of papers because I wanted to give her some of the
Hmm.
printouts that I had. So I probably looked like I was holding a clipboard or something, and I had a bright blue polo shirt on. So yeah, I looked like the Schwann's guy. Anyway, but so she's like, yeah, I can get that to him. Um, and no, I never heard back. So I haven't heard anything from him. Um, I would assume that he's read it. I feel like I've hassled enough people connected to him and him who would have had some exposure to this, and even to the point of letting them know, just saying, hey, last chance, this is going to press. If you want to comment, this is your last chance to do it. So I think people are pretty aware that this was happening. So I'm guessing he has read it. The one clue that I have that he probably did is apparently a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago now, I heard back from the museum folks who said Casey was just in here.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
So
That's
apparently
pretty
he
big.
stopped in and visited, and not sure what he looked at or if he went through his files. I don't know. But he was apparently at the museum, so it's
All right.
interesting choice.
Casey, if you're listening, reach out to Jeremy and
You have my number, man. You have my number. You've got my address. You've got everything. Like,
Yep.
give me a call.
All right, Jeremy, is there anything else you think, or is there anything else that you would like to discuss, talk about, something that we didn't cover that you think is really important or just interesting about this entire process?
Really two things. I talked a little bit about being really appreciative that the investigative team was willing to talk. There were other people too. There was a WCCO photojournalist who talked to me. I actually drove up. He lived in a cabin in northern Minnesota. I drove up and interviewed him personally, got him on tape, and he passed away a couple months later. Bob Mannery. So, and that was a really helpful interview, and he gave me some really great stuff. So it's been so meaningful that people sometimes is, something that's sort of one of the last things they do are willing to talk about this and tell their own story. And I've had that a lot. Even people that wouldn't go on the record. Like I said, I talked to a lot of people who wouldn't go on the record, but what they had to say was really valuable in helping me get a sense of what Princeton was like and why people would have made decisions they made, and really pushed me away from some really early assumptions that I was wrong about. Like I was like, oh, maybe it's a small town that's not used to outsiders, and it's the opposite. Princeton's really used to outsiders. People move in all the time. It's right on the highway. They're used to having people come in and out, and so that's not some sort of insular thing in Princeton. And that was something early on. I was like, I wonder if it's like that. No, it's not. And so having people tell me that and in confidence be just like, no, you're wrong on this, was just hugely helpful. And I can't source them because they're off the record, or on background. But all those people, I couldn't have done the story without them. And honestly, the support of Forum. I mean, there are not many news organizations anymore that are willing to commit the time and resources and everything, support to have somebody do a project like this anymore. It just doesn't happen very much anymore. So yeah, I can't say enough about Forum and Steve, who personally invested in it himself by going reporting on it, to back this project. So yeah, it's been quite a ride.
If you want to check out Minnesota Vice, I've included a link in our show notes. The series includes a lot of interesting information and storylines that we did not cover in this episode. As always, if you'd like to support The Vault, the easiest way to do so is to give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. Favorable ratings increase visibility, which means more coverage for the cases we cover. I'm Trisha Taurinskas. Thank you for listening.